You weren't invited. Go home before you embarrass the family. My father stood at the White House security checkpoint waving his gold embossed pass like a weapon. He looked me up and down, assuming I was there to serve drinks. I did not argue. I simply handed my digital credential to the Secret Service hostess. The scanner chimed a high priority alert. The hostess lost all color in her face. She turned to the four-star Admiral beside her and whispered, "Sir, she is here. My name is Meredith Caldwell. I am 33 years old and the founder of the nation's most elite cybersecurity firm. Before I tell you how I brought my toxic family to their knees on national television, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to prove your worth to people who treated you like nothing." The crisp morning air in Washington District of Columbia carried the familiar scent of ambition and expensive cologne. I stood quietly near the East Executive Avenue entrance of the White House. The early sun reflected off the pristine white columns of the historic building, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Around me, the most powerful defense contractors and military officials in the country gathered for the highly anticipated presidential address on national security. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the low hum of high-stakes networking. I took a deep breath and adjusted the cuffs of my tailored navy suit. It was understated but impeccably made. I did not need flashy designer labels to prove my worth anymore. I was no longer the frightened 26-year-old girl my family had thrown out onto the streets to fend for herself. Today I was stepping into the absolute center of global power. The security lines leading into the compound were heavily guarded by Secret Service agents in dark suits with earpieces catching the sunlight. There were two distinct lines forming on the pavement. One was the general admission line for standard corporate executives and desperate defense contractors hoping to secure federal funds. The other was the VIP checkpoint, reserved strictly for high-ranking military personnel and top-tier intelligence directors. I stood off to the side of the VIP lane, simply observing the crowd and mentally preparing for the presentation I was about to deliver. I watched the politicians and the executives shake hands and exchange fake smiles. It was a world of smoke and mirrors, a world my family thrived in. That was when I heard it. The loud, booming laugh that had haunted my nightmares for 7 long years. I turned my head slightly and spotted them standing in the middle of the general admission line. My father, Harrison Caldwell, and my older brother, Preston. They were both dressed in flashy, bespoke tuxedos that screamed new money and desperate arrogance. My father was the chief executive officer of Caldwell Logistics and Defense. Preston was his vice president and the undisputed golden child of our toxic family. They were performing their usual predictable routine for everyone around them. My father was slapping other contractors on the back, laughing entirely too loudly, and dominating every conversation within earshot. Preston stood right beside him, nodding along with a smug smile, soaking up the proxy respect that his father demanded from the crowd. They looked so confident, so incredibly sure that they owned the world and everyone in it. They had absolutely no idea that their precious company was bleeding money at an alarming rate. They had no idea that they were currently failing the new federal security mandates required to keep their government contracts. And they certainly had no idea that I was the sole architect of those exact mandates. For a long moment, I just watched them. I studied the graying hair at my father's temples and the permanent arrogant smirk on my brother's face. A heavy rush of painful memories threatened to surface. I remembered the night they publicly humiliated me. I remembered the way my father had violently destroyed my reputation in the tech industry simply to protect Preston's fragile ego and cover up his massive mistakes. I remembered the way they had left me with absolutely nothing, forcing me to rebuild my life from scratch in a windowless basement. But the anger did not consume me. Instead, it fueled a cold, calculated focus that settled deep in my chest. I had spent 7 years building my company Aegis Vanguard in total secrecy. I operated exclusively in the shadows, protecting national security infrastructure, while my family mocked my supposed failure from the comfort of their country clubs. Today, the shadows were finally meeting the light, and the collision was going to be spectacular. My father's eyes suddenly swept over the crowd and landed directly on me. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. His booming laugh died instantly in his throat. He nudged Preston sharply and pointed in my direction. I watched as they broke away from their group in the general admission line and marched straight toward me with heavy, aggressive steps. The pure arrogance rolling off them was palpable. My father looked me up and down, taking in my unbranded navy suit and my obvious lack of a visible entry lanyard. Because of his own massive ego, he completely misread the situation. He assumed my presence near the security checkpoint meant I was working the event as a caterer or perhaps a low-level event coordinator desperate for a paycheck. Meredith, he scoffed, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. What on earth are you doing here? Are you lost? I kept my posture perfectly straight and met his gaze without blinking. I am exactly where I need to be, I replied evenly, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Preston chuckled, shaking his head as he looked at my sensible shoes. Come on, Meredith, he sneered, crossing his arms over his expensive tuxedo. Do not tell me you are still doing entry-level tech support work. Did the catering company hire you to fix their broken tablets today? My father did not even wait for my response. He pulled out his gold embossed general admission pass and waved it right in front of my face like a trophy. He wanted to make sure I knew my place. He wanted to remind me of the cruel hierarchy he had violently enforced my entire life. You weren't invited, he said, his tone turning harsh and commanding. Go home before you embarrass the family. I have very important clients here today, and I will not have my failure of a daughter wandering around the grounds passing out appetizers to people who actually matter. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not try to defend my presence or explain my worth to men who were incapable of seeing it. I simply turned away from him and stepped directly up to the VIP Secret Service checkpoint. My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh behind me. You cannot go through there. He sneered loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. That line is for actual dignitaries. Security is going to throw you out into the street. I ignored his desperate taunts. I pulled my phone from my pocket and presented my highly encrypted digital credential to the Secret Service hostess, standing at the wooden podium. She looked bored and exhausted as she raised her digital scanner. But the very second the red laser read my custom QR code, the scanner let out a sharp, distinct chime. It was a high-priority clearance alert reserved only for the absolute top tier of federal intelligence. The hostess stared at her screen in pure shock. All the color instantly drained from her face. Her eyes went incredibly wide with sudden realization. She completely ignored my father and brother, who were still chuckling cruelly behind me. She turned immediately to the 4-star Admiral, standing at the security desk beside her. She leaned in and whispered frantically, "Sir, she is here." The Admiral snapped to immediate attention. He looked at me, his expression shifting to one of absolute respect and awe. He stepped forward past the security podium and offered me a crisp, perfect military salute. "It is a profound honor to finally meet you in person, ma'am," he said, his strong voice carrying clearly over the chatter of the morning crowd. "Please come right this way. We have been waiting for you." The Secret Service agents moved in perfect unison. They unhooked the heavy velvet ropes and pulled them wide open, clearing a massive direct path for me into the White House grounds. The silence from my father and brother was sudden and deafening. I could practically feel their shock radiating through the cold morning air. Suddenly, sheer panic and unadulterated greed replaced their smug arrogance. Seeing the Admiral salute me and the armed agents part the ropes, my father completely changed his tune in a fraction of a second. He lunged forward, grabbing Preston by the sleeve and trying to push his way through the VIP lane right behind me. "Wait!" my father shouted to the guards, frantically flashing his plastic general admission pass again. "We are with her. We are family. We go where she goes." The Secret Service agents did not hesitate for a single second. Two heavily armed guards stepped squarely into the gap, physically blocking my father and brother from advancing a single inch further. Their hands rested firmly on their belts. The Admiral looked at my father with eyes like solid ice. "Sir, you are in the general admission line," the Admiral stated, his voice ringing with absolute unquestionable authority. "Please step back immediately, or you will be forcibly removed from the premises." I did not turn around. I did not look back to see their humiliated faces or watch them scramble to process their shattered reality. I simply adjusted the lapel of my navy suit, walked through the open velvet ropes, and stepped confidently into the halls of power, leaving them entirely behind. The heavy oak doors of the Eisenhower Executive Office building closed behind me with a resonant thud, shutting out the noise of the street and the pathetic image of my father and brother trapped behind the velvet ropes. I walked down the wide corridors. The polished marble floors echoed with the sharp click of my heels. Portraits of past leaders lined the walls, watching my every step. The air inside smelled of old paper and raw power. As a Secret Service agent escorted me toward the grand ballroom, my eyes caught sight of a framed Department of Defense contractor seal hanging near a security checkpoint. The golden eagle emblem gleamed under the warm lighting. My chest tightened. That exact same seal had been embossed on the frosted glass doors of the Caldwell Logistics and Defense Headquarters in Virginia. Seeing it now yanked me violently backward through time, dragging me into a memory I had spent 7 years trying to suppress. 7 years ago, I was 26 years old. I was not a chief executive officer. I was a low-level data analyst buried in the windowless sub-basement of my father's corporate empire. My desk was a cramped cubicle shoved next to the server cooling vents, where the constant mechanical hum gave me daily migraines. Despite having a master's degree in cybersecurity, I was kept at the absolute bottom of the corporate hierarchy. My father, Harrison Caldwell, had made it perfectly clear that women in his family were meant to marry well and host charity galas, not write code. My brother Preston, however, had been given a corner office on the executive floor the moment he barely scraped by with a mediocre business degree. Preston was the Vice President of Digital Infrastructure, a title he held purely by the virtue of his birthright. I did the heavy lifting, I ran the diagnostic checks, I reviewed the threat matrices. Preston signed his name on my daily reports and collected his massive bonus checks. I kept my head down and accepted the disrespect because I still naively craved my father's validation. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my brilliance, they would finally see me as an equal. That dangerous illusion shattered completely on a rainy Tuesday in November. Caldwell Logistics was contracted to provide a massive supply chain software update for the Department of Defense. It was a multi-million-dollar deployment designed to track global troop movements and weapon shipments. I was assigned to do the final redundant diagnostic sweep. It was supposed to be a standard rubber stamp procedure. Instead, I found a ghost in the machine. Buried deep within the thousands of lines of code, I spotted a catastrophic vulnerability. It was a brilliantly disguised backdoor exploit. If this software update went live, it would grant foreign adversaries untraceable real-time access to classified military logistics routes. Enemies would know exactly where our troops were moving and what weapons they were carrying before the commanders on the ground even received their orders. The implications were chilling. It was a monumental breach of national security. My hands shook as I compiled the data. I spent 48 straight hours awake, living on black coffee and sheer adrenaline, mapping out the exact nature of the vulnerability and writing a comprehensive patch to eliminate the threat. I printed the 70-page diagnostic report, put it in a red high-priority folder, and took the elevator up to the executive floor. Preston was sitting behind his massive oak desk, practicing his golf putt into a glass tumbler when I walked in. He sighed loudly, rolling his eyes as I dropped the red folder onto his desk. He told me he was too busy preparing for a luxury vendor retreat to look at my low-level data logs. I refused to leave. I stood my ground and forced him to read the executive summary. I watched his bored expression transform, first into confusion, then into shock, and finally into a cold, calculating greed. Preston was technically incompetent, but he was a master at corporate survival. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was holding a golden ticket. "Leave the folder," Preston had said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "I will review it and pass it up the chain." "Good job, Meredith." I went back down to my windowless basement feeling a rare spark of pride. I thought I had saved the company. I thought my father would finally call me into his office and praise my intellect. I thought I had finally earned my seat at the table. I was so incredibly stupid. 1 week later, an emergency company-wide email was blasted to every employee. Harrison Caldwell proudly announced that his brilliant son Preston had single-handedly discovered and neutralized a critical threat in the Department of Defense software update. Preston was instantly promoted to Senior Executive Vice President. He was given a massive stock option bonus and celebrated as a cybersecurity visionary in an industry press release. My name was never mentioned. I was completely erased from my own discovery. The betrayal cut deep, making it hard to breathe. But the personal insult quickly faded into absolute terror when I pulled up the live server logs to review the implementation of my patch. My blood ran completely cold. Preston had not used my carefully written patch. He had deemed my code too complex and too time-consuming to implement before his promised deployment deadline. Instead, he had applied a cheap, automated Band-Aid fix. He had simply masked the vulnerability without actually closing the back door. To the untrained eye, the software looked secure. But any hacker with a moderate amount of skill could easily bypass Preston's flimsy firewall. He had practically gift-wrapped American military logistics and handed them to our enemies. He did not just steal my work. Out of sheer incompetence and arrogant laziness, he had doomed the entire deployment. Panic seized my chest. This was no longer about family politics or stolen credit. This was about American lives. Soldiers would die because my brother wanted a promotion and a quick headline. I sprinted out of the sub-basement and bypassed Preston's office entirely. I took the stairs directly to the executive boardroom where my father was holding a meeting with the senior partners. I knew the risk I was taking, but national security outweighed my fear of my father's wrath. I burst into the antechamber of the boardroom, clutching the diagnostic logs showing Preston's failure. But I never made it to the heavy mahogany doors. Preston stepped out of a side hallway and blocked my path. His face was twisted into an ugly snarl. He grabbed my arm so hard his fingers bruised my skin, shoving me violently against the wall of the corridor. He knew I would check his work. He knew I would try to blow the whistle. He had been waiting for me. "You need to calm down and go back to your desk, Meredith," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "You are making a fool of yourself." I shoved him back, waving the diagnostic logs in his face. "You botched the patch, Preston," I screamed, my voice echoing off the expensive artwork lining the hallway. "The back door is still open. You deployed a compromised system to the Pentagon. You have to stop the launch right now, or I will go to the federal authorities myself." Preston did not panic. He did not apologize. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Go ahead. Tell them. See who they believe. The decorated senior vice president or the unstable low-level data clerk who is throwing a tantrum because she is jealous of her brother's success." Before I could push past him, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. My father stood in the threshold, his face dark with fury at the interruption. The senior partners peered out from behind him, looking annoyed. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison bellowed, his voice vibrating with rage. I opened my mouth to explain the catastrophic security breach. I opened my mouth to save his company and the lives of the soldiers who depended on our software. But Preston was faster. He was a predator who had already laid his trap perfectly. Preston quickly arranged his face into an expression of deep fraternal concern. He looked at our father with faux sympathy, playing the role of the protective older brother to absolute perfection. "Dad, I am so sorry for the disruption," Preston said, his voice smooth and steady. "Meredith is having another episode. I tried to talk to her, but she is hysterical. She found out about my promotion and she is making up wild stories about my code being defective. She is trying to sabotage the Department of Defense launch out of pure jealousy." I gasped, staring at my brother in pure horror. It was a masterful, flawless lie. He had preemptively poisoned the well, completely destroying my credibility before I even spoke a single word. He weaponized my history of struggling with anxiety, twisting it to make me look like an unstable, envious monster. I turned to my father, holding out the papers, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Dad, please, you have to look at these logs," I begged, desperation tearing at my throat. "Preston is lying. The code is broken. The entire system is vulnerable. You have to listen to me." My father did not look at the papers. He did not look at the data. He looked at me with a gaze so filled with pure disgust that it stopped my heart. He had already made his choice. He had chosen the golden son over the scapegoat daughter exactly as he always did. The flashback dissolved abruptly as the Secret Service agent cleared his throat gently, bringing me back to the present moment inside the Eisenhower Executive Office building. I blinked away the ghost of that terrible day, straightening my spine as the grand ballroom doors came into view. The memory no longer held any pain. It only held power. I was ready. The grand ballroom doors stood right in front of me, flanked by stern-looking military guards. But my mind was stuck on another set of doors from 7 years ago. The heavy frosted glass doors of the Caldwell Logistics Executive Boardroom. After my confrontation with Preston in the hallway, I had retreated to my desk, completely naive to the corporate slaughter being orchestrated above me. I truly believed my father would call a private meeting to review the data logs. I believed the security of a multi-billion-dollar Department of Defense contract would outweigh my brother's fragile ego. The next morning, I received a formal summons to the top floor. I gathered my encrypted drives and the red priority folder, feeling a surge of anxious relief. I assumed reason had prevailed. I walked into the boardroom expecting a technical audit with the engineering heads. Instead, I walked into an execution. My father, Harrison Caldwell, stood at the head of the massive glass table. The entire executive committee was seated around him. The chief financial officer, the chief operations officer, and the lead legal counsel were all present. Their faces were carved from stone. Right beside my father sat Preston. He was not looking at data. He was leaning back in his leather chair, tapping an expensive pen against his chin, wearing an expression of deeply practiced sorrow. I placed my folder on the glass table. I started to explain the backdoor exploit, the compromised supply chain, the immediate threat to the military grid. My father slammed his hand down flat against the glass, silencing me instantly. He did not ask to see my code. He did not ask a single technical question. He turned to the board and delivered a speech that effectively destroyed my life. He claimed I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. He stated with absolute cold conviction that I had fabricated the entire security threat simply because I could not handle seeing my older brother succeed. He called me a paranoid, jealous liability. Those specific words hit me like physical blows. Paranoid, jealous, liability. He told the executives that my jealousy had reached a dangerous tipping point and that I was willing to sabotage an essential national security launch just to steal the spotlight from Preston. I looked around the room, begging someone to look at the actual data. These were men and women I had worked alongside for years. They all stared at their notepads or their expensive watches. No one met my eyes. They all knew Preston was a technical moron. But they also knew that a patched code meant a delayed launch, and a delayed launch meant their stock options would plummet. My father was not just protecting his golden boy, he was protecting their wealth. Harrison Caldwell looked me dead in the eye, his face devoid of any paternal warmth. He told me my employment was terminated effective immediately for gross insubordination and threatening corporate assets. He signaled the corner of the room. Two massive private security guards stepped forward. They grabbed my arms with bruising force and marched me out of the boardroom. I fought against their grip, shouting that the code was broken, screaming that people would die. Preston just watched me go, shaking his head with a pathetic sigh of fake brotherly pity. They dragged me through the main lobby in front of hundreds of employees and threw me out onto the concrete steps of the building. I was completely shattered, but I thought I still had a home. I thought I still had a mother. I drove my modest sedan back to our massive family estate in Great Falls, Virginia. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I convinced myself that my mother, Catherine, would listen to reason. She was a mastermind of Washington high society, an elite socialite who understood the lethal consequences of a public scandal. I thought she would step in to mediate to fix the fracture before it became permanent. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the mansion, expecting a shouting match. What I found was a calculated silent dismissal that hurt far worse than my father's screaming. My suitcases were sitting perfectly aligned in the center of the marble foyer. 3 black leather bags packed, zipped, and waiting. Catherine stood at the base of the grand curving staircase. She was wearing a flawless beige cashmere sweater and pearl earrings, her hair impeccably styled for a charity luncheon. She looked at me with absolute icy detachment. There was no maternal warmth in her gaze, only the cold calculation of a public relations manager cutting out a tumor to save the host body. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling as I pointed to the luggage. She did not raise her voice. Her quiet, elegant tone sliced through me like a razor. "You have made a terrible mess, Meredith," she said, adjusting her diamond watch. "Your father called me from the office. You tried to humiliate your brother in front of the entire executive board." I tried to stop a compromised software launch. I cried out, stepping toward her. "Preston stole my work and he broke the code. He is going to get people killed." Catherine sighed, a delicate, weary sound of supreme annoyance. "You are socially inept," she stated, stating it as a simple, indisputable fact. "You have always been incapable of being a team player. You refuse to understand how this world works. The Caldwell name requires unity. It requires absolute loyalty. You are willing to tear down your own blood to satisfy your neurotic need to be right. We cannot have that kind of toxicity in our home." I stared at her, unable to comprehend the absolute betrayal. She was choosing the family brand over my life. She was choosing an illusion over the truth. "You are no longer welcome in this house," Catherine said, turning her back on me and placing her hand on the mahogany banister. "Take your bags and leave. Do not call us until you are ready to apologize to your brother and accept your place in this family." She walked up the stairs without looking back once. The estate manager stepped forward and opened the front door, waiting for me to leave. I grabbed my bags and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, severing my ties to the only family I had ever known. I was thrown out into the cold, with nothing but the clothes in my bags and a small amount of money in my personal checking account. I rented a cheap motel room on the edge of the city, believing that my talent would save me. I was a brilliant cybersecurity analyst. I thought I could simply find another job, rebuild my life, and prove them wrong. But the Caldwell punishment did not end at the property line. My father was a ruthlessly vindictive man who demanded absolute submission. When I did not call begging for forgiveness within the first week, he decided to ensure I had absolutely nowhere else to go. I spent the next month applying to every major tech firm, defense contractor, and cybersecurity agency in the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia area. At first, the recruiters were incredibly eager. They saw my credentials, they saw my resume, and they practically begged to bring me in for interviews. I sailed through the initial technical assessments. I aced the coding exams. I was always told I was the top candidate for the job. Then, right before the final hiring stage, every single door slammed violently in my face. Job offers were rescinded overnight with zero explanation. Interviews were abruptly canceled. Headhunters who had previously flooded my inbox suddenly refused to return my emails. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Then a sympathetic recruiter at a mid-tier firm finally took pity on me and told me the truth off the record. Harrison Caldwell had made calls. My father had used his massive network of golf buddies, defense contacts, and corporate allies to completely destroy my professional reputation. He had personally contacted the chief executive officers of every major tech firm in the region. He told them I was a severe security risk. He branded me as unstable, litigious, and prone to stealing corporate secrets. In an industry where trust and discretion were the only currencies that mattered, he had made me completely radioactive. He ensured I was thoroughly blacklisted from the entire industry. No one would touch me. No one would even grant me a meeting. He wanted to starve me out. He wanted to drain my bank account, break my spirit, and crush me under the weight of poverty, until my only option was to crawl back to his doorstep on my hands and knees, willing to accept whatever miserable subservient life he chose to give me. Left entirely on my own, isolated and broke, I sat on the edge of a stained motel mattress, staring at my dwindling bank balance. That was the moment the old Meredith died. The daughter who craved her father's approval vanished. The sister who tried to help her brother ceased to exist. They wanted me to be a paranoid liability. Instead, I chose to become their absolute worst nightmare. I left that cheap motel the very next morning. My remaining funds were desperately low. I scoured the classifieds for the cheapest housing I could find and ended up in Arlington. It was a cramped, windowless basement apartment under a decaying brick house. The air constantly smelled of damp earth and old copper pipes. There was no natural light. My only sense of time passing came from the glowing numbers on my computer screen and the heavy footsteps of the landlord walking across the creaking floorboards above me. The space was barely large enough to fit a twin mattress and a folding card table which I used as my workstation. The contrast between this damp concrete box and the sprawling Caldwell estate, with its manicured lawns and vaulted ceilings, was staggering. But I did not shed a single tear over the loss of luxury. The Caldwell mansion had been a gilded cage. This concrete box, no matter how cold or damp, was entirely mine. Surviving those first few months pushed my body and mind to the absolute limit. I had to learn how to exist on practically nothing. I lived on cheap, instant noodles and bulk bags of rice. I sold my designer clothes and the few pieces of modest jewelry I had brought with me just to keep the electricity turned on. The physical toll of sudden poverty was brutal. The basement had no proper heating system, so I slept in my winter coat during the freezing winter nights. I remember staring at my breath pluming in the freezing air, calculating exactly how many days I could survive before my bank account hit zero. My father had intended for this exact suffering to break me. He designed this punishment to force my submission. He expected me to call him shivering and hungry, begging for my old bedroom back. I chose to freeze instead. I quickly realized that my legal identity was effectively dead. The name Meredith Caldwell was completely toxic in the corporate world, thanks to my father and his relentless smear campaign. Any resume carrying that name was instantly flagged and discarded by human resources departments across the country. I could not apply for traditional jobs. I could not ask for references. I had to become a ghost. I spent a week building an entirely new, untraceable digital footprint. I routed my internet connection through a complex series of encrypted proxy servers. I created a phantom identity protected by layers of heavy encryption. In the physical world, I was a broken outcast living in a damp basement. In the digital world, I became a faceless, nameless entity with absolute freedom to operate outside the rigged corporate systems my father controlled. To pay my rent and buy food, I had to turn to the grueling world of freelance bug bounty programs. Corporations and tech startups would offer small cash rewards to independent hackers who could find security flaws in their systems. It was exhausting, mind-numbing work. I was scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel, hunting for basic coding errors and simple vulnerabilities on low-level websites. I was a master-level cybersecurity architect forced to do the digital equivalent of sweeping floors for pennies. I worked 18 hours a day, staring at scrolling lines of code until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. Sometimes I would spend 3 straight days mapping out a complex network flaw, only to be paid a meager $200. It was an insulting fraction of what my skills were actually worth, but it kept the landlord away and the internet running. The psychological toll was far heavier than the physical deprivation. The isolation was completely overwhelming. I had no friends, no mentors, and absolutely no safety net. When I finally closed my eyes to sleep, the demons would come. I suffered from terrible nightmares. I would wake up gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. In the quiet darkness of the basement, I could hear the echoes of my mother calling me socially inept and toxic. I could hear my father roaring that I was a jealous liability. I saw Preston smiling that smug, victorious smile as he stole my work and tossed me to the wolves. The trauma of their betrayal was a heavy, suffocating blanket. There were dark, terrifying moments when the loneliness became so intense that my hand would hover over my phone. The urge to call my mother just to hear a familiar voice would claw at my chest. The urge to surrender to stop the pain and the cold was a constant battle. But I fought that urge with every ounce of strength I possessed. Every time the ghost of my father expectations tried to crush me, I channeled that pain into raw energy. I refused to let my trauma turn me into a permanent victim. Instead, I let the struggle harden me. The deep sadness and the desperate craving for parental validation slowly burned away, leaving behind nothing but pure calculated ambition. I stopped crying. I stopped wishing for a family that never truly existed. I realized that crying over the Caldwells was a waste of precious time. They were not my family. They were my adversaries. The basement stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a crucible. The intense heat and pressure of poverty were burning away my weaknesses, forging me into something unbreakable. As the months dragged on, my perspective fundamentally shifted. I realized why my father had been able to destroy me so easily. I had been playing his game. The corporate world was a rigid vertical ladder built and controlled by men exactly like Harrison Caldwell. They owned the human resources departments. They controlled the background checks. They decided who was allowed to climb and who was thrown off the rungs. As long as I tried to climb their ladder, I would always be at their mercy. Sending out resumes and hoping for permission to exist in their space was a guaranteed losing strategy. You cannot win a rigged game by playing harder. You have to flip the table entirely. That was my massive epiphany. If you cannot climb the corporate ladder, you buy the building. If you cannot get hired by a defense contractor, you must become the entity that dictates whether those contractors survive. I could no longer operate as a low-level employee seeking a paycheck. I had to become an undeniable force. I had to own the board. My father relied on outdated networks, golf course handshakes, and old money influence. He did not understand the modern digital battlefield. He thought power was located in corner offices and country clubs. I knew true power lived in the code holding the entire world together. He controlled the visible market, but I decided I was going to control the shadows. I applied this new ruthless mindset directly to my bug bounty work. I stopped hunting for minor glitches on retail websites. I stopped chasing $200 payouts. I began targeting the massive invisible infrastructure networks that held up the banking sectors, the defense grids, and the international supply chains. I looked past the surface-level firewalls and hunted for the deep systemic flaws that highly paid corporate engineers always missed. I knew exactly how these lazy executives operated because I had watched Preston do it for years. They cut corners, they ignored complex data, they prioritized launch dates over actual security. I used their own arrogant laziness against them. I was no longer a desperate freelancer sweeping floors. I positioned myself as an apex predator in the digital ecosystem. I spent weeks infiltrating test servers for major financial institutions, leaving no trace of my presence. I mapped out their entire networks, identifying catastrophic vulnerabilities that could cost them billions in a single afternoon. I did not disrupt their systems or steal their data. I simply documented the flaws with surgical precision. I compiled reports that were masterpieces of threat intelligence. The basement in Arlington was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a command center. I covered the concrete walls with printed data flows and threat matrices. I stopped feeling cold. I stopped feeling hungry. I was completely consumed by the architecture of my new empire. The transition from victim to mastermind was complete. The Caldwell family thought they had buried me alive. They thought putting me in the dirt would be the end of my story. They did not realize that I was a seed. The darkness, the isolation, and the immense pressure did not crush me. It allowed me to take root. I was growing a massive, invisible network right beneath their feet. I was preparing to shake the very foundation of their world. I was no longer Meredith Caldwell, the discarded daughter. I was something entirely new. I was a phantom building an arsenal preparing for the exact moment I would step out of the dark and take everything they loved. My transformation from a discarded daughter into a digital apex predator required a target worthy of my new skills. I did not waste my time searching for minor glitches in consumer software or low-level corporate firewalls. I aimed directly at the central nervous system of the American economy. Using my untraceable alias, I began running passive non-intrusive scans on the routing node protocols of the federal banking system. It was the digital equivalent of quietly listening to the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The architecture was ancient complex and layered with decades of patched-over code from a dozen different defense contractors. My father and his peers had built these walls. They were arrogant enough to believe those walls were impenetrable. On a Tuesday morning at 3 o'clock, the numbers on my screen stopped making sense. I noticed a microscopic anomaly in the data flow. It was a tiny fraction of a millisecond delay in the synchronization between the primary ledger servers and the backup network. A lazy analyst would have dismissed it as simple server lag. A corporate vice president like my brother Preston would never have even looked at the raw data. But I was hungry, and I was meticulous. I isolated the anomaly and pulled it apart line by line. What I found made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a zero-day exploit hidden deep within the foundational architecture of the federal banking grid. It was an apocalyptic vulnerability. The flaw existed in the validation sequence that authenticated massive institutional transfers. If a hostile entity discovered this tiny crack, they could force the entire system to desynchronize. They could erase digital ledgers, wipe out trillions of dollars in institutional wealth, and completely collapse the American financial grid in a matter of hours. The global economic fallout would be immediate and irreversible. It was the holy grail of cyber warfare. And I was the only person on the planet who knew it existed. I sat back in my folding chair staring at the flashing green text in the dark basement. The sheer magnitude of my discovery was terrifying. I was a blacklisted analyst living in a damp concrete box wearing 2 sweaters just to keep my hands from shaking in the cold. I had less than $50 to my name. If I took this zero-day exploit to the dark web, I could sell it to the highest bidder by midnight. Hostile foreign governments or elite cyber syndicates would gladly pay tens of millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency for a weapon of this magnitude. I could buy a private island. I could disappear forever and leave my father and his corrupt industry to burn in the fallout of their own incompetence. The temptation was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I closed my eyes and pictured the Caldwell estate. I pictured my mother standing on the grand staircase telling me I was toxic. I pictured my father firing me to protect his golden child. Selling the exploit would be the ultimate revenge. It would destroy their world completely. But as I sat in the freezing darkness, I realized that selling the exploit would also make me exactly like them. It would make me a greedy, ruthless predator, willing to sacrifice innocent people for personal gain. If I sold out the grid, I would be no better than Preston deploying a broken patch for a promotion. I refused to let their cruelty turn me into a mercenary. I also could not simply hand the discovery over to a corporate contractor. If I reported the vulnerability through standard channels, a company like Caldwell Logistics would simply steal my work, bury the threat to protect their stock price, and pay me a pathetic finder fee to stay quiet. I needed a third option. I needed to prove my absolute supremacy. I decided I would not just report the vulnerability. I would build a flawless, impenetrable patch entirely on my own. I would solve the apocalyptic threat, and I would deliver the solution directly to the highest authority in the nation. I locked the basement door and disconnected my personal devices. For the next 7 days, I did not leave the room. I did not sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. I survived on tap water and sheer obsessive focus. Writing a patch for a core federal banking system from a single folding table was a monumental task. The code had to be perfect. It had to integrate seamlessly with decades-old architecture without triggering any internal security alarms. I built a simulated sandbox environment on my local servers to test the patch, isolating every possible variable. I wrote thousands of lines of code, stripping away the lazy corporate bloat that contractors had left behind. I fortified the validation sequence. I closed the zero-day exploit and wrapped the entire protocol in a new layer of dynamic encryption. When I ran the final simulation, the system registered 0 vulnerabilities. The patch was a flawless piece of digital architecture. Now came the most dangerous part of the operation: delivering the patch. Sending an email to a generic government tip line would guarantee my work would be ignored or stolen by mid-level bureaucrats. I needed to drop this directly onto the desk of the people who truly controlled the nation's security. I targeted the National Security Agency. I did not want to attack them. I wanted to send a message. Using my phantom alias, I constructed a heavily encrypted backchannel. I carefully probed the outer firewalls of the agency, searching for a blind spot. It was incredibly risky. A single mistake would trigger a federal manhunt, and I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. My heart hammered against my ribs as my fingers flew across the keyboard. I navigated through their defensive layers, moving like a ghost through the digital tripwires. I bypassed their intrusion detection systems and located a highly secure internal server used exclusively by their top-tier cyber intelligence directors. I did not steal a single file. I did not disrupt their operations. I simply opened a secure directory and dropped my package inside. The package contained the complete diagnostic report of the zero-day exploit, a detailed map of the catastrophic fallout it could have caused, and my flawless custom patch ready for immediate deployment. I also included a brief text file. It contained no demands for money. It contained no threats. It simply explained the flaw, provided the solution, and offered a secure encrypted relay channel if they wished to discuss the future of their infrastructure. I signed it with my alias. Then I wiped my tracks, closed the back channel, and severed the connection. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark basement listening to the silence. The die was cast. The response did not take weeks. It took less than 14 hours. I was sitting on my mattress eating cold rice when my encrypted relay channel flared to life. The incoming connection was masked, but the routing signature possessed a level of sophisticated encryption that only the highest echelons of the federal government could utilize. I accepted the connection. A secure text window opened on my screen. The message was brief and intensely professional. They had analyzed my report. They had tested my patch in their own classified sandbox environments. They confirmed the severity of the zero-day exploit, and they were absolutely stunned by the elegance and perfection of my solution. The code I had written in a freezing basement had just saved the American economy from a catastrophic collapse. The intelligence directors did not send federal agents to kick down my door and arrest me. They understood exactly what they were dealing with. They recognized that the person operating behind this alias possessed a level of brilliance that far surpassed any traditional corporate contractor they had on their payroll. I had accomplished in 7 days what their billion-dollar defense partners had failed to do in a decade. The text cursor blinked on my screen, waiting for my response. The underground government intelligence operatives did not want to prosecute me. They wanted to recruit me. They realized that traditional defense companies like Caldwell Logistics had grown lazy, bloated, and dangerously incompetent. They needed a shadow architect. They needed someone who operated outside the stagnant bureaucratic system, someone who could build unbreachable fortresses around the nation's most critical assets. They offered me a protected federal status. They offered me unlimited operational freedom, massive black budget funding, and absolute anonymity. I would no longer be a starving freelancer scrambling for pennies. I would become a top-tier asset for the intelligence community, operating with resources most defense contractors could only dream of possessing. I typed my acceptance into the secure chat window and hit enter. In a matter of seconds, my entire reality shifted. Funds were immediately wired to a secure offshore account, granting me instant financial autonomy. Instructions for establishing a legitimate front company were transmitted through the secure relay. I closed the chat window and slowly stood up from my folding table. I looked around the damp, windowless basement that had been my prison and my crucible for the past year. I did not feel cold anymore. I walked over to the small duffel bag in the corner and packed my few remaining possessions. I walked up the creaking wooden stairs and stepped out into the blinding sunlight of a new day. Meredith Caldwell, the blacklisted data analyst, was officially dead. In her place, a powerful, protected federal asset was stepping into the light, ready to build an empire. The game had completely changed. Stepping out of that Arlington basement was like taking my first real breath in a year. The federal funds had already cleared into a secure account, rendering my previous financial terror entirely obsolete. I did not buy a sports car or a luxury penthouse. I bought infrastructure. Within 48 hours, I leased a highly secure, nondescript commercial space in Alexandria, Virginia. From the outside, it looked like a failed logistics hub. Inside, I built a digital fortress. I ordered server racks, military-grade encryption hardware, and biometric security systems. I named the company Aegis Vanguard. An aegis is a mythical shield meant to protect the gods. A vanguard is the foremost part of an advancing army. I intended to be both. The federal intelligence directors kept their word. They funneled massive black budget contracts directly to my secure servers. These were not the public-facing bureaucratic contracts that my father and brother fought over at country club dinners. These were classified operations that officially did not exist. I tracked state-sponsored hacking syndicates, dismantled human trafficking financial networks, and fortified the digital perimeters of nuclear facilities. My operational freedom was absolute. I answered to no corporate board, no shareholders, and certainly no arrogant vice presidents. Building the empire required a team. I could no longer operate as a solitary ghost if I wanted to scale Aegis Vanguard to its full potential. I began recruiting, but I did not look at Ivy League graduating classes or legacy defense firms. I knew exactly how broken that system was. Instead, I hunted for the outcasts. I tracked down brilliant coders who had been fired for speaking the truth. I recruited data analysts who had been blacklisted by men like Harrison Caldwell because they refused to participate in corporate cover-ups. I found a genius network architect who had been pushed out of the industry for lacking the right social pedigree. I brought them into Aegis Vanguard and paid them double the industry standard. I gave them total creative control and absolute loyalty. In return, they gave me their brilliance. We became a phantom army of marginalized experts operating entirely behind the scenes. We were a company of ghosts protecting a nation that did not even know our names. While I was busy securing the American electrical grid, my family remained completely oblivious to my resurrection. In their minds, I was still the disgraced, socially inept dropout wallowing in poverty. My mother, Catherine, made sure to remind me of this perceived reality on a regular basis. She never called me. Calling would require hearing my voice and potentially dealing with actual emotions. Instead, she weaponized text messages. Her messages would arrive randomly, slipping through the silence to deliver perfectly crafted insults disguised as maternal concern. I would be standing in my command center watching my team neutralize a foreign cyber attack when my personal phone would buzz. The screen would light up with a message from Catherine. Preston just bought his third boat. It is a beautiful yacht. We are having a christening party this weekend. I suppose you are still doing computer repair. Let me know if you need me to mail you a plate of leftovers. 2 months later, while I was signing a classified 9-figure contract with the Department of Defense, another text would arrive. Your father and I are summering in the Hamptons. I saw a girl working at a coffee shop who looked just like you, but she looked exhausted. Are you eating properly? We can send you a grocery gift card if you are struggling. Do not let your pride starve you, Meredith. A year after that, when Aegis Vanguard officially surpassed Caldwell Logistics in net operational value, the most condescending message of all appeared. Preston is being profiled in a business magazine this month. We bought 50 copies. It is such a shame you refused to be a team player. You could have been his assistant by now. I never replied, not to a single message. I did not block her number either. Blocking her would have signaled that her words still had the power to hurt me. I let the messages arrive and I read every single one. I used her toxic gaslighting as pure, unadulterated fuel. Every time she bragged about Preston buying another luxury item with his fraudulent bonuses, I wrote another proprietary algorithm that rendered his legacy systems completely obsolete. Every time she offered me a pathetic grocery gift card, I acquired another federal contract that my father company had desperately bid on. They thought their words were cutting me down, but they were actually sharpening my blade. The sheer volume of work Aegis Vanguard was handling began to reshape the entire cybersecurity landscape in the capital. The federal government quickly realized that traditional defense contractors were vastly overcharging for outdated defective software. My company provided flawless, unbreakable security architecture at a fraction of the time. The intelligence directors started quietly diverting massive infrastructure projects away from the legacy firms and handing them directly to me. I was slowly, methodically suffocating my father's corporate empire by simply being undeniably better than him. I watched from the shadows as Caldwell Logistics started to lose their grip. Their quarterly earnings reports, which I monitored with clinical detachment, began to show significant profit losses. They were losing bids. They were failing basic security audits. Preston was completely incapable of understanding why their software patches were continually rejected by the Department of Defense. He lacked the technical capacity to comprehend that the testing parameters had been secretly rewritten by my team. We were setting the new national standard, and Preston was barely qualified to operate a basic spreadsheet. The irony was incredibly satisfying. Harrison and Preston Caldwell were attending elite Washington galas, shaking hands with politicians, and pretending they still controlled the industry. They wore expensive suits and drove luxury cars, completely blind to the fact that their corporate foundation was rotting away. They did not know that the brilliant phantom architect the government officials kept whispering about with total reverence was the exact same woman they had dragged out of their boardroom and thrown onto the street. My team at Aegis Vanguard knew the truth about my past. I built a culture of absolute transparency within our secure walls. They knew exactly what the Caldwell family had done to me because many of them had survived similar corporate abuses. This shared history created an unbreakable bond among us. We were not just building software, we were dismantling a corrupt hierarchy. We worked late into the night ordering takeout and running complex simulations, laughing as we watched legacy defense firms scramble to meet our impossible security standards. For the first time in my entire life, I felt a genuine sense of belonging. I had finally found my family, and I had handpicked every single member. As the years passed, my transformation solidified. The timid, desperate girl who had craved her father validation was completely gone. I evolved into a ruthlessly efficient chief executive officer. I learned how to negotiate with 4-star generals without blinking. I learned how to project absolute authority in rooms filled with powerful, intimidating men. I wore sharp, tailored suits, not to impress anyone, but as a uniform of my own design. My posture changed. My voice lost its tentative edge. I moved through the world with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a woman who knows she holds all the cards. The 5-year mark of Aegis Vanguard existence was a quiet milestone. We did not throw a lavish party or issue a press release. We simply deployed a new encryption grid for the Federal Reserve and went back to work. But internally, I knew we had reached the pinnacle. We were no longer just a consulting firm. We were the absolute authority on digital threat intelligence in the United States. If the government needed a system secured, they came to me. If they needed a foreign threat neutralized, they came to me. I had achieved total supremacy without ever showing my face to the public. Then the landscape shifted again. The threats against the national grid were becoming more sophisticated, and the legacy contractors were failing at an alarming rate. The Department of Defense realized that simply diverting contracts to Aegis Vanguard was not enough. The entire infrastructure of American corporate defense needed to be purged and rebuilt. The lazy, incompetent nepotism that allowed men like Preston Caldwell to hold executive titles was no longer just an annoyance. It was a critical liability to the survival of the nation. The intelligence directors called me into a highly classified meeting. They needed to implement a sweeping, aggressive new security standard across all federal departments. They needed a mandate so incredibly strict that any company failing to meet the requirements would be immediately stripped of their government clearance. They asked me to be the sole architect of this new protocol. They gave me absolute authority to write the rules. I sat in my secure office looking at the federal request. I thought about the defective code Preston had deployed 7 years ago. I thought about my father slamming his hand on the glass table and calling me a liability. I thought about my mother packing my bags and telling me I was socially inept. I looked at the most recent text message sitting unanswered on my phone from Catherine, reminding me that Preston was a genius who deserved his success. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I accepted the federal commission. I began drafting the protocol that would become the ultimate test for every defense contractor in the country. I poured every ounce of my expertise into the architecture, ensuring the standards were completely unbreachable. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was building the precise mechanism that would finally expose my family incompetence to the entire world. I was setting the stage for their absolute ruin. The silent climb was officially over. It was time to lock the doors and start the fire. The concept of a zero-trust architecture is exactly what it sounds like. You trust absolutely no one. You verify every single action, every single user, and every single data packet moving across your network. You assume that the network is always hostile and that a breach is always imminent. I spent 3 straight weeks locked inside my secure command center, coding the foundational framework for the mandate. I poured every ounce of my expertise into creating a digital guillotine designed specifically for lazy developers and arrogant executives. I stripped away all legacy privileges. I mandated complex microsegmentation. I required continuous real-time cryptographic validation for every piece of software interacting with federal defense systems. It was brutal and it was unforgiving. It was a mirror held up to an industry that had grown fatally complacent. The Department of Defense adopted my protocol without changing a single comma. The Secretary of Defense recognized the sheer brilliance of the architecture and immediately pushed it through the final oversight committees. The federal mandate was officially signed into effect. A hard deadline was set. Every single defense contractor in the United States of America was legally required to pass my strict security parameters to maintain their government clearance. Failure to comply meant an immediate termination of all active federal contracts and a permanent freeze on all future defense funding. There were no exceptions. There were no grandfather clauses. There were no golf course waivers. The day the mandate went live, the panic across the corporate defense sector was a tangible, vibrating force. My dedicated team at Aegis Vanguard monitored the national compliance dashboards in real time. We watched as massive defense conglomerates realized their billion-dollar networks were practically made of paper. The initial failure rates were staggering. Highly paid corporate executives who had spent decades coasting on their family names and political connections were suddenly forced to prove their actual technical competence. They were completely unequipped for the reality of the modern digital battlefield. My mandate was slaughtering their outdated methodologies. But my eyes were fixed on one specific dashboard metric. I ignored the aerospace giants and the global weapon manufacturers. I watched the live diagnostic feed for Caldwell Logistics and Defense, my father's empire. Preston was officially the Senior Executive Vice President of Digital Infrastructure. He was the golden child, the supposed genius who had saved the company 7 years ago. He was directly responsible for ensuring Caldwell Defense met the new federal compliance standards. I sat in my ergonomic chair sipping black coffee and watched his entire department burn to the ground. The diagnostic logs from Caldwell Logistics poured into my secure servers, painting a masterpiece of absolute incompetence. It was a digital bloodbath. Preston had completely failed to modernize their systems. He had outsourced basic encryption protocols to cheap third-party vendors to maximize his own departmental budget. His firewalls were entirely obsolete. His user access controls were virtually non-existent. The grading algorithm I designed flagged his entire corporate network with critical, catastrophic failure warnings within the first 3 minutes of the scan. Caldwell Logistics failed the penetration tests. They failed the data encryption validations. They failed the threat isolation protocols. Preston was scrambling trying to apply the same cheap automated Band-Aid fixes he had used 7 years ago. But my new system was designed to detect and reject those exact lazy shortcuts. Every single patch he submitted was instantly denied by my automated defense grid. The financial consequences for Caldwell Logistics were immediate and incredibly brutal. The moment my system flagged them as non-compliant, their active federal funding was frozen. The corporate bleeding was catastrophic. I watched my father's stock price plummet in real time on my secondary monitors. Wall Street analysts noticed the frozen contracts and immediately downgraded Caldwell Defense to a strong sell. Billions of dollars in market valuation vanished in a matter of days. Harrison Caldwell was facing absolute ruin. My father panicked. Instead of auditing his own systems or firing his incompetent son, he resorted to his usual ruthless tactics. He started liquidating other valuable corporate assets just to keep the company afloat. I read the internal corporate filings. Harrison fired hundreds of innocent warehouse workers and low-level analysts to offset the massive financial hemorrhage caused by Preston. He was destroying the livelihoods of loyal employees simply to protect his golden boy from facing any actual accountability. It was the exact same toxic behavior that had led to my termination. He had learned absolutely nothing. While the company was collapsing around them, my mother remained either blissfully ignorant or willfully blind to the reality of the situation. Her text messages shifted from outright bragging to subtle, bitter complaints about the economy, though she maintained her deeply toxic tone. My personal phone buzzed on my desk, bringing another one of Catherine's carefully crafted insults. She complained about having to sell one of their luxury vacation homes in Aspen. She blamed the current political administration for being openly hostile to traditional defense contractors. She claimed that rogue government bureaucrats were creating unnecessary red tape just to punish successful families like ours. A week later, another message arrived. She boasted that Harrison had secured an exclusive VIP invitation to an upcoming elite White House summit. She claimed my father was going to speak directly to the President of the United States. She assured me he was going to fix the ridiculous new regulations and put those incompetent government pencil pushers in their place. She ended the text by reminding me that Preston was working late every night, holding the company together like a true leader. She asked if my little computer business was still keeping me busy or if I needed her to send me a care package of canned goods. She had absolutely no idea that the red tape she was complaining about was me. I was the impenetrable wall her husband and son were repeatedly crashing into. They were blaming faceless government bureaucrats when the architect of their destruction was the very daughter they had thrown into the street. The White House summit she bragged about was scheduled for the end of the month. It was not just a simple networking gala. It was designated as the official federal enforcement deadline for the Zero Trust mandate. The Director of National Intelligence had requested my physical presence at the event. For 7 years, I had operated as a total ghost, shielding my identity behind layers of corporate encryption and proxy servers. I had built Aegis Vanguard in the shadows, directing the defense of the nation without ever showing my face to the public. But the time for hiding was officially over. The federal government needed a visible leader to enforce the massive industry purge, and I was the only person qualified to hold the blade. It was finally time to step out of the dark and into the unforgiving light. I stood in my private office looking at the final definitive compliance report for Caldwell Logistics and Defense. They scored a catastrophic 14% on the mandate audit. They were completely dead in the water. Without a massive federal bailout or an unprecedented security waiver, their company would be forced to file for bankruptcy by the end of the fiscal quarter. They were bleeding out and they were entirely desperate. They were walking into the White House summit expecting to charm their way out of a total collapse. Harrison Caldwell genuinely believed he could use his gold-embossed invitations, his expensive bespoke tuxedo, and his old money connections to bypass the most rigorous security protocol in American history. He expected to shake hands with military generals, play a round of golf with politicians, and secure a massive financial rescue package for his failing son. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their estranged, despised daughter held the absolute keys to their survival. I locked the Caldwell compliance report inside my highly encrypted digital briefcase. The trap I had spent 7 years designing was fully set. I called my lead intelligence analyst into my office and confirmed our secured transport to Pennsylvania Avenue. The digital guillotine was fully assembled, tested, and ready for deployment. My father and brother thought they were attending a high society celebration. They did not realize they were walking directly into an execution. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit and walked out of the command center. I was ready to bring the Caldwell Empire straight to the ground. The heavy mahogany doors swung inward, opening to reveal the grand ballroom of the White House. It was a staggering masterpiece of gilded architecture and historic weight. Massive crystal chandeliers cast brilliant, sparkling light over the polished marble floors, illuminating a vast sea of high-ranking military uniforms and expensive tailored suits. This room was the absolute nexus of American defense and global intelligence. 4-star generals conversed quietly with senior senators. Intelligence directors huddled in secure corners holding hushed conversations that would ultimately determine the fate of international security. I stepped into the room with absolute quiet confidence, taking in the magnitude of the gathering. A uniformed server holding a polished silver tray offered me a glass of expensive champagne. I politely declined, taking a simple glass of sparkling water instead. I needed my mind perfectly sharp for the execution I was about to oversee. I navigated the crowded floor with the practiced ease of a woman who completely owned the space. A few steps into the room, a familiar face broke away from a tight group of naval officers. It was the United States Secretary of Defense. He was a towering, intimidating man with decades of combat service etched deeply into his stern features. When he saw me, his serious expression instantly dissolved into a look of profound, genuine respect. He extended a firm hand. "It is an absolute privilege to have you here today, Meredith," he said, his deep voice carrying a warmth reserved strictly for his most trusted allies. "We have been reviewing your final audit algorithms all morning. Your architecture is nothing short of revolutionary." We shook hands. I smiled, accepting his high praise with practiced grace, knowing the massive power it truly held. We spoke for several minutes, discussing the upcoming compliance purge that would soon tear through the defense industry like a wildfire. He introduced me to a highly exclusive circle of top-tier intelligence directors and joint chiefs. These were the men and women who controlled the federal budget. They were the ultimate decision-makers of the military-industrial complex. They treated me not as a subordinate contractor, but as an indispensable, vital partner. They hung on my every word, asking highly targeted, complex questions about network vulnerabilities and threat mitigation protocols. I was holding court at the highest possible level of the federal government. I explained the precise mechanics of the new dynamic encryption layers my team at Aegis Vanguard had meticulously developed. I watched these incredibly powerful officials nod in unison, completely captivated by my strategic vision. They recognized that I was the shield standing between their classified data and hostile foreign adversaries. There was no condescension in their eyes. There was only pure, unadulterated reverence. I had spent 7 long years working in total anonymity, buried in a damp basement, and hidden behind encrypted servers. Standing in the light, receiving the direct appreciation of the highest military command in the nation was a deeply validating experience. But my focus remained entirely tactical. I knew this pleasant networking was merely the prelude to the main event. I kept my posture relaxed, but my awareness was perfectly dialed in, scanning the room for the specific targets I had come here to destroy. The trap was beautifully constructed. I just needed the prey to step inside. Across the massive ballroom, a distinct sudden commotion caught my attention. The heavy entrance doors at the far end of the hall opened to admit the final wave of attendees from the general security line. Among the crowd of frustrated, exhausted contractors, I spotted my father and brother. Harrison and Preston Caldwell looked significantly less polished than they had an hour ago outside the security gates. The oppressive heat of the Washington morning, combined with the long, humiliating wait in the general admission line, had taken a visible physical toll on their bespoke tuxedos. Their collars looked tight and their expressions were strained. My father was practically vibrating with nervous, desperate energy. He was scanning the room with the frantic, wide eyes of a drowning man, desperately searching for a life raft in a violent storm. I knew exactly why he was panicking. Caldwell Logistics and Defense was officially bleeding out. My newly implemented security mandate had frozen their federal funding, and their company stock was completely tanking on the open market. They were standing in this prestigious room because they absolutely needed a federal bailout. They needed to find a sympathetic general or a corrupt politician willing to sign a waiver to bypass the stringent new regulations. My father grabbed Preston by the shoulder and pointed aggressively toward the center of the room. He had spotted the Secretary of Defense. He recognized the cluster of four-star generals surrounding the Secretary. That specific group represented the exact lifeline Caldwell Logistics needed to survive the fiscal quarter. My father straightened his tie and plastered on his fake, charismatic corporate smile. He nudged Preston, urging his golden boy to get ready to deliver their highly practiced, desperate pitch. They began to march across the ballroom entirely unaware of the digital executioner standing right in the middle of their target group. I watched them approach from the corner of my eye, carefully maintaining my steady, engaging conversation with the military directors. My father was moving aggressively, elbowing past junior officers and mid-level bureaucrats without offering a single word of apology. He was completely focused on reaching the Secretary of Defense before anyone else could interrupt. But as he closed the distance, his gaze shifted slightly to the left. He noticed the civilian woman standing directly in the center of the elite military circle. He noticed the dark, tailored navy suit. He noticed my profile. I saw the exact second recognition struck him like a physical blow to the chest. His confident, arrogant stride faltered instantly. He stopped dead in his tracks, causing a passing waiter holding a tray of appetizers to nearly collide with his back. His jaw clenched tight. From across the crowded room, I could read the absolute sheer horror flashing violently across his face. In his deeply narcissistic mind, there was only one possible logical explanation for my presence in this highly secure ballroom. He still fully believed I was a blacklisted college dropout living in grinding poverty. He still completely believed the toxic narrative he had fabricated to destroy my life 7 years ago. Therefore, he instantly assumed I had illegally sneaked into the event. He assumed I was working as a low-level event coordinator, a desperate caterer, or perhaps an IT technician brought in through the service entrance to fix a broken microphone. He could not process any other reality. Worse than simply being there, he saw me standing directly next to the Secretary of Defense. He saw me actively speaking to the exact federal officials he desperately needed to impress to save his failing empire. His mind instantly jumped to the most catastrophic conclusion possible. He genuinely thought I was bothering them. He thought I was aggressively begging for a job or loudly complaining about my financial struggles to the most powerful men in Washington. He believed my mere presence was a toxic radioactive embarrassment that was going to permanently destroy his last chance at securing a corporate bailout from the government. Panic completely overrode his supposed high society manners. My father grabbed Preston by the arm and gestured wildly in my direction. I watched my brother face contort with a mixture of profound shock and utter pure disdain as he finally spotted me standing among the highly decorated generals. They did not hesitate for another single second. They practically shoved a junior senator out of the way to accelerate their rapid pace. They were marching toward me with furious, determined strides, cutting a path of sheer desperation through the elegant crowd. They were coming to intercept me, to drag me away from the military brass and physically silence me before I could ruin their reputation and sabotage their carefully planned pitch. It was pathetic and highly revealing. They were so blinded by their own deep-seated prejudice that they completely failed to notice the obvious context clues surrounding my presence. They failed to notice that the generals were listening to me with rapt, absolute attention. They failed to see the unmistakable respect radiating throughout the room. As they closed the final few critical yards, the Secretary of Defense excused himself to take an urgent classified phone call, stepping away and leaving me standing completely alone. I was now perfectly exposed for their desperate ambush. The timing was absolutely flawless. The heavy footsteps of my father and brother ceased the moment they reached me. I stood perfectly still facing the polished marble pillar near the eastern alcove. Before my father could even open his mouth to unleash his fury, a sharp, manicured hand clamped down violently on my left forearm. The grip was tight enough to instantly bruise the skin beneath the fabric of my navy suit. I did not flinch. I simply turned my head and looked down at the source of the assault. My mother, Catherine Caldwell, had finally arrived. She must have entered through the diplomatic reception room moments before. She wore an emerald green designer gown that likely cost more than a standard military pension. Her diamonds caught the light of the grand chandeliers, but her face was twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. She yanked my arm hard, attempting to physically drag me backward into the shadows of the marble pillar, completely out of sight from the high-ranking officials mingling nearby. "What on earth do you think you are doing?" Catherine hissed, her voice a venomous whisper designed not to echo across the ballroom. The sheer panic in her eyes betrayed the heavy layers of expensive makeup she wore. She leaned in so close I could smell the sharp metallic notes of her signature perfume. "You have absolutely no right to be here. Did you sneak in through the service entrance? Are you trying to destroy this family completely?" I smoothly but forcefully pried her fingers off my arm. I adjusted my sleeve deliberately, slow, maintaining absolute eye contact. "I did not sneak in, Catherine," I replied, keeping my tone as cold and flat as frozen steel. I walked through the front door. My father stepped in, closing the physical distance to trap me against the pillar. His face was flushed an angry, mottled red. The veins in his neck stood out against his stiff collar. He was breathing heavily, radiating the desperate energy of a cornered animal. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little failure," he growled, jabbing a thick finger entirely too close to my face. "I do not know whose badge you stole or what pathetic catering company hired you to pass out napkins today, but you are going to turn around and march out of that service door right now. We are actively trying to secure a multi-million-dollar federal contract to save this company, and I will not let your toxic, desperate presence ruin our chances with the Secretary of Defense." Preston stood right behind him, shifting his weight from foot to foot, with a deeply arrogant smirk playing on his lips. My brother had always been a coward who hid behind our father's wrath. Now he stepped out from the shadow, eager to deliver his own calculated insults. He looked me up and down, examining my understated suit with undisguised contempt. "Look at you, Meredith," Preston sneered, letting out a sharp, barking laugh. "You look absolutely desperate. Did you buy that suit off a clearance rack just to come here and play dress-up? You really need to stop pretending you belong in these rooms. The people here are serious defense contractors, not unstable dropouts looking for a handout." I stared at my older brother. He was the senior executive vice president of digital infrastructure. He was the man responsible for the catastrophic zero-day exploits 7 years ago. He was the exact reason their company was currently failing the strict federal audits I had personally designed. Yet here he was standing in the White House, completely oblivious to his own impending doom, trying to humiliate the very person who held the absolute power of life and death over his entire career. The sheer, profound level of his delusion was almost fascinating to witness. "You must be struggling," Preston continued, his voice dripping with fake, condescending pity. "It has been 7 years, Meredith. I am sure whatever little freelance computer repair gigs you have been doing are not paying the bills. You look thin. You look exhausted. It is genuinely pathetic to watch you stalk our family like this, just hoping to catch some of our scraps." Catherine crossed her arms tightly over her chest, nodding in aggressive agreement. "It is a profound embarrassment. she added, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. We told everyone you were working overseas. We tried to give you a dignified cover story, and now you show up here looking like a stray dog begging for attention. If the media sees you, or if any of our corporate partners realize who you are, it will be a complete public relations nightmare for Caldwell Logistics. They were handing me the absolute perfect ammunition. Every single word falling from their lips was a testament to their greed, their malice, and their total lack of basic human decency. They were not just insulting me, they were actively confessing their toxic manipulation. They were admitting to the false narratives they had spun to protect their fragile public image. I kept my expression entirely unreadable. I did not cross my arms. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing a single ounce of emotional distress. Instead, I smoothly slid my right hand into the deep pocket of my tailored trousers. My fingers quickly located the smooth glass of my secure federal smartphone. Using a blind, tactile shortcut I had programmed myself, I double-tapped the side button and activated the high-definition audio recording application. A tiny, subtle vibration confirmed the device was now actively capturing every single sound within a 10-foot radius. The trap was officially armed. Now I just needed them to walk completely inside and pull the lever themselves. Is that what you really think, Preston? I asked, allowing a tiny fake sliver of vulnerability to enter my voice. You think I came here to beg for a job from the family that threw me away? Preston took the bait immediately, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. Of course you did. He laughed loudly, running a hand through his expensive, perfectly styled hair. Why else would you be creeping around the defense summit? You finally realize that you cannot survive in the real world without the Caldwell name protecting you. You realize that your little tantrum 7 years ago was a massive career-ending mistake. My father leaned in closer, his tone shifting from pure rage to a sickening kind of corporate negotiation. Listen to me, Meredith Harrison said, lowering his voice to a harsh, gravelly register. I am a reasonable man. I am willing to offer you a way out of this pathetic life you have built for yourself. But you are going to take the deal right now, and then you are going to disappear from this building before anyone else sees you. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on his. I am listening, Harrison. Tell me about this generous deal. Preston stepped in front of our father, eager to play the role of the benevolent, powerful executive. I will give you a job in my department. Preston offered a smug, triumphant grin stretching across his face. It is an entry-level information technology support position. You will be resetting passwords and managing the local servers in the basement. I will authorize a salary of $45,000 a year. It is absolute charity on my part considering you are a known security liability, but it will keep a roof over your head. You take the 45 grand, you keep your mouth completely shut, and you never ever try to speak to the executive board again. I let the absolute silence stretch between us for 5 long seconds. I wanted the recording to capture the dead air. I wanted the audio file to perfectly preserve the profound, humiliating nature of his offer. The architect of the National Zero Trust Security Mandate, the chief executive officer of Aegis Vanguard, the woman who actively controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in federal black budget contracts, was currently being offered $45,000 a year to reset passwords by a man who could not even write a basic encryption patch. And if I refuse your generous charity, Preston? I asked, keeping my tone dangerously soft. Catherine scoffed loudly, stepping forward to flank my brother. If you refuse, you will continue to rot in whatever miserable hovel you currently live in. She spat, her eyes flashing with pure malice. You will continue to be a complete failure. You have zero leverage here, Meredith. You have no power. You have no connections. You are absolutely nothing without us. We own this industry. My father nodded firmly, pointing a threatening finger at my chest. If you do not take the job and leave this building right now, I will personally call the Secret Service over here. I will tell them you are an unstable corporate stalker. I will have you physically dragged out of the White House in handcuffs. I destroyed your reputation once, Meredith. Do not make me do it again. I will make sure you never work a single day in your miserable life. The recording was capturing absolute gold. The extortion, the threats, the clear admission of past sabotage. It was all securely digitized and uploading in real time to my encrypted cloud servers. They were digging their own graves with heavy industrial machinery, and they were far too blinded by their own supreme arrogance to notice the dirt falling back down on top of their heads. You truly believe you own this industry, Harrison? I asked, my voice dropping its fake vulnerability and returning to its natural cold authority. You believe Caldwell Logistics is still the untouchable giant it was a decade ago. My father bristled at my tone, his face reddening again. We are the backbone of the Department of Defense, he growled proudly. We are securing a massive bailout contract today that will guarantee our supremacy for the next 20 years. You know absolutely nothing about the modern defense sector. You are a paranoid, jealous liability who could not handle the pressure of the big leagues. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the sharp, terrifying smile of a predator watching a trapped animal struggle against the wire. I am sure Preston will lead the company into a very bright future. I said, my words laced with heavy, lethal sarcasm. After all, he is the genius who secured the perimeter 7 years ago. Preston puffed out his chest, completely missing the danger in my eyes. I am the genius of this family, he stated proudly, puffing out his chest. I saved that deployment, and I am going to save the company today. You just need to accept your place, Meredith. Stop pretending you belong in these rooms. Take the charity job and go home. The heavy velvet curtains at the front of the grand ballroom suddenly parted. The massive crystal chandeliers above us slowly dimmed, signaling the start of the official presidential address. The ambient noise of the crowded room instantly hushed. The high-ranking military officials and defense contractors quickly moved toward the central stage, taking their designated positions. The trap was fully loaded. The bait had been taken. The countdown to absolute ruin had officially begun. I reached into my pocket and blindly pressed the side button on my phone, ending the recording and locking the encrypted file. I looked at the 3 people standing in front of me. They were not my family. They were just outdated legacy obstacles waiting to be demolished. I will not be taking the IT job. Preston, I said, my voice slicing through the quiet room with absolute icy precision. And I strongly suggest you pay very close attention to the stage. You are about to learn exactly how the modern defense sector actually works. Before any of them could respond to my chilling warning, a sharp mechanical tone echoed over the massive ballroom speaker system. The room fell into total absolute silence. The sharp mechanical tone reverberated loudly through the massive ballroom. The presentation was officially beginning. My father refused to let my defiance stand. Harrison Caldwell operated on a fundamental need for absolute dominance, and my refusal to cower in the face of his threats had pushed him past the brink of rational thought. As the crowd turned their attention toward the stage, he lunged forward and grabbed my elbow. He yanked me roughly backward, pulling me deeper into the heavy shadows of the marble pillar. "Are you listening to me, you delusional brat, Harrison?" hissed his hot breath, grazing my cheek. The mechanical tone sounded again, signaling the imminent arrival of the president, but my father was completely consumed by his own toxic ego. "You do not get to walk away from me. You do not get to issue warnings to my son. I will call the armed guards right now and have you thrown onto the pavement where you belong. If you so much as look at one of my clients tonight, if you even breathe in the direction of a defense official, I will make sure you are locked in a psychiatric hold by midnight." Preston stepped up right beside him, a nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Dad, let it go," Preston whispered urgently, his eyes darting toward the stage where the heavy velvet curtains were shifting. "The speech is starting. We need to be in position when they announce the corporate bailout recipients. Let security handle her." But Harrison was too far gone. He wanted to break me. He needed to see me shatter just like he had 7 years ago in that corporate boardroom. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but my mind was moving at light speed. The first recording had captured their general harassment, and Preston offering me a humiliating job, but I needed the absolute kill shot. I needed the definitive, undeniable proof that my father knew exactly what he was doing when he destroyed my career. I subtly slipped my hand back into my pocket. My thumb found the tactile button. One firm press. The subtle vibration against my palm confirmed the encrypted audio application was recording once again. "You are terrified, Harrison," I whispered, keeping my voice dangerously level. "You are standing in the most secure building in the world, and you are completely terrified of your own daughter. Because you know the truth. You always knew the truth. I do not fear failures." Harrison spat, his jaw clenching so tightly the muscles trembled. I leaned in, closing the distance between us. I dropped my voice to a razor-sharp edge, forcing him to strain to hear me over the swelling orchestral music playing from the stage speakers. "Did you ever actually look at the diagnostic logs I gave you 7 years ago?" I asked, locking my eyes onto his. "Did you ever run a single independent audit on the code Preston deployed? Or did you just blindly trust your golden boy while he handed a massive unencrypted backdoor straight to hostile foreign intelligence agencies?" Preston flinched violently at the accusation. "Dad, tell her to shut up." Preston stammered, his face draining of color. "She is doing the exact same thing she did back then. She is making up lies to sabotage my success." I ignored Preston entirely, keeping my deadly focus locked on my father. "You fired me to protect him," I stated, baiting the trap with surgical precision. "You destroyed my life to protect a man who cannot even write a basic firewall. You put national security at risk just to protect the Caldwell brand." The accusation struck the exact nerve I was aiming for. Harrison Caldwell possessed an ego so massive it blinded him to basic self-preservation. He could not stand being accused of negligence, and he absolutely could not tolerate being questioned by the daughter he viewed as a subservient peasant. The trap was set, and my father walked directly into the center of it with his chest puffed out in sheer toxic arrogance. "I did exactly what a strong chief executive does," Harrison sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh guttural register that the microphone in my pocket captured with crystal clarity. "I protected the most valuable asset in my company. I did not need to look at your pathetic little data logs, Meredith. I knew exactly what was at stake. If I had paused the deployment to humor your hysterical theories, the company stock would have plummeted. The board would have panicked. I sacrificed you because you were entirely expendable." He pointed a thick, rigid finger directly at my face. "Preston is the genius of this family. You are a failure who could not handle the pressure. You are a weak, unstable girl who wanted to tear down her own brother out of pure spite. I did what had to be done to maintain our supremacy. Now keep your mouth shut and get out of my sight before I end you permanently." The trap snapped shut with a deafening digital finality. I did not blink. I did not shed a tear. I simply stared at the man who had just handed me the very weapon I needed to completely obliterate his empire. He had just confessed on a highly secure, federally encrypted recording to knowingly covering up a massive national security vulnerability. He had explicitly admitted to firing me maliciously to protect his incompetent son and falsely inflate his corporate stock. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of their malice and fraud. There was no defense attorney on Earth who could spin that audio file into anything other than a blatant admission of federal treason and corporate sabotage. I pressed the button inside my pocket, locking the recording and uploading it directly to my shadow servers in Alexandria. The digital file bypassed the local network, traveling through military-grade encryption tunnels until it was permanently secured in a vault they could never touch. "You have always been remarkably predictable, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a chilling, emotionless whisper. "You just could not resist having the last word." The massive crystal chandeliers dimmed completely, plunging the audience into a hushed, expectant shadow. The murmurs of the elite crowd vanished instantly as the heavy velvet curtains parted. The President of the United States walked onto the stage. He was closely followed by the Director of National Intelligence. The sheer gravity of their presence immediately commanded the absolute respect of every single defense contractor in the room. The sudden appearance of the Commander-in-Chief snapped my father out of his toxic rage. He released my arm and quickly stepped back, smoothing the lapels of his wrinkled tuxedo. He was completely oblivious to the digital execution he had just triggered. Preston checked his watch. This is it, Preston whispered, his voice trembling with eager anticipation. We need to get closer to the stage, Dad. Catherine Caldwell appeared from behind the marble pillar, joining her husband and son. She glared at me one final time. You heard your father? She hissed, giving me a dismissive wave. The adults are conducting business now. Run along, Meredith. Go find a service exit before you humiliate yourself any further. I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground, leaning casually against the cold marble pillar, watching them prepare for their glorious moment of salvation. They were so incredibly eager, so desperately certain that their wealth and connections would protect them from the harsh reality of their own incompetence. They truly believed they were about to be handed a multi-million-dollar lifeline by the federal government. I watched my father adjust his posture, standing tall and proud. I watched my brother practice his humble victory smile. I watched my mother look around the room, ready to accept the jealous stares of her socialite peers. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already opened up, and they were currently in free fall. The Director of National Intelligence stepped up to the podium and adjusted the microphone. The harsh feedback echoed across the silent ballroom, causing several front-row attendees to flinch. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, the director began, his voice resonating with deep, uncompromising authority. We are here today to address a critical fundamental shift in the landscape of American national security. For far too long, we have allowed outdated methodologies and complacent corporate contractors to dictate the safety of our digital borders. That era of lazy arrogance ends today. I watched my father's smile widen. He leaned over and whispered to Preston, "He is talking about our weaker competitors. This is our moment. We are going to sweep the board." I stayed perfectly silent, savoring the profound, devastating irony of his delusion. The trap was fully loaded. The executioner was walking to the block, and Harrison Caldwell was cheerfully polishing the very blade that was about to sever his head. The Director of National Intelligence gripped the edges of the heavy wooden podium. His stern gaze swept across the silent ballroom, capturing the absolute attention of every billionaire defense contractor and military general in attendance. The modern digital battlefield is no longer fought with tanks and artillery, the director stated, his voice projecting a grim, uncompromising reality that echoed off the gilded ceilings. It is fought in the silent architecture of our financial grids, our power plants, and our military supply chains. And in this new war, we are currently losing. I watched my father nod solemnly, mimicking the grave expression of a concerned patriot. He leaned closer to Preston, muttering quiet, arrogant praises about his own supposed foresight. We have relied on legacy corporations who have grown fat on federal funds. The director continued, his tone sharpening into a lethal weapon. We have trusted corporate dynasties that prioritize profit margins over national security. They have deployed defective code. They have ignored catastrophic vulnerabilities. They have allowed pure arrogant incompetence to leave the American people exposed to hostile foreign syndicates. A collective nervous murmur rippled through the audience. Wealthy executives shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits, suddenly realizing this was not a congratulatory gala. This was a reckoning. But Harrison Caldwell remained completely unfazed. He actually smiled. He turned his head slightly and shot me a vicious, triumphant glare. He mouthed the words "watch" and leaned to me, fully believing the director was talking about his competitors. Effective immediately, the President has authorized the creation of a new specialized National Cybersecurity Oversight Board, the director announced, projecting a massive digital seal onto the screens behind him. This board will operate with an initial operational budget of $800 million. Its sole directive is to ruthlessly purge the federal ecosystem of lazy, incompetent contractors. Any company failing to meet the new Zero Trust protocols will have their government clearance permanently revoked. There will be no appeals. There will be no second chances. Preston literally bounced on the balls of his feet. His breathing quickened with pure, unchecked greed. $800 million, he whispered feverishly to our father. We are going to secure the primary oversight contract, Dad. We are going to own the entire defense sector. Catherine adjusted her diamond necklace, standing slightly taller against the marble pillar. She was already picturing the exclusive charity galas. She would host the glossy magazine covers featuring her brilliant son. They were entirely captivated by the grand illusion of their own supreme dominance. They were mentally spending federal dollars they believed were already sitting in their bank accounts. To lead this unprecedented purge, we needed an architect. The director stated, his voice filling the cavernous ballroom and demanding absolute silence. We needed someone who operates outside the stagnant, corrupt ecosystems of legacy tech firms. We needed the phantom developer who single-handedly identified an apocalyptic zero-day exploit in our federal banking system and provided a flawless, unbreachable patch while traditional defense firms were completely blind to the threat. Preston puffed out his chest. He reached up and adjusted his silk bow tie, a smug, practiced smile stretching across his face. He actually took a half step forward, separating himself from the crowd preparing to be called onto the stage. He genuinely believed his stolen credit from 7 years ago had somehow miraculously translated into this moment. He believed he was the phantom. His profound delusion was almost fascinating to witness. This individual has spent the last 5 years building the most elite threat intelligence agency in the world, operating entirely in the shadows to protect our nation. The director continued, pointing a finger toward the audience. She designed the new Zero Trust mandate. She holds the absolute keys to our digital future. Today, the President of the United States and I are profoundly honored to bring her out of the shadows. My father froze. His smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. He blinked rapidly, processing the specific pronoun the director had just used. She. Preston stopped mid-step. His expensive leather shoe hovered awkwardly over the polished marble floor. He looked back at his father, a desperate, confused panic bleeding into his wide eyes. The air in their lungs suddenly evaporated. Catherine stopped adjusting her necklace. Her manicured hands dropped limply to her sides. Please join me in welcoming the recipient of the Presidential Medal for Cybersecurity and the newly appointed director of the National Oversight Board. The director announced, his voice ringing with absolute triumphant clarity. The Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Vanguard, Meredith Caldwell. The words dropped into the grand ballroom like a localized seismic event. For one singular, terrifying microsecond, my family stopped breathing entirely. Harrison Caldwell's jaw went completely slack. His eyes widened to a comical, unnatural degree. All the blood drained violently from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, gasping ghost. He stared at the stage as if the director had just spoken in a foreign language. Preston staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest by a heavy, blunt object. His knees visibly buckled. His hands began to shake violently at his sides. Catherine let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both of her trembling hands, her diamond rings catching the ambient light of the room. High above us, the technician in the lighting booth flipped a heavy mechanical switch. A brilliant, blinding white spotlight instantly cut through the dim ballroom. It did not swing toward the front row where the legacy executives stood. It swept directly across the massive crowd, bypassing hundreds of wealthy defense contractors until it landed squarely on the marble pillar in the eastern alcove. The intense heat of the spotlight hit me. I stood perfectly still, bathed in the radiant, blinding light. I did not flinch. I did not smile. I simply held my head high, the absolute embodiment of quiet, terrifying power. I let the light wash over my understated navy suit, proving to every single person in the room that I did not need flashy designer labels to command absolute authority. The entire room erupted. It was not polite, generic applause. It was a deafening, thunderous roar of genuine, profound respect. 4-star generals and seasoned intelligence directors began striking their hands together with fierce enthusiasm. Senators and cabinet members turned toward the spotlight, their faces filled with awe and profound gratitude. The military officials I had been speaking with earlier snapped to immediate attention, offering me crisp, perfectly synchronized salutes. My family was trapped inside the blinding radius of my spotlight. They were completely paralyzed, pinned down by the crushing, suffocating weight of their own catastrophic miscalculations. Harrison stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He was desperately trying to reconcile the pathetic college dropout he had just threatened to throw into the street with the federal titan the President of the United States was currently applauding. His brain simply could not process the reality of his absolute violent destruction. The man who had blacklisted me from the industry was now staring at the woman who owned the entire board. Preston looked like he was about to vomit. His face turned a sickly shade of gray, causing him to lean heavily against our mother for physical support. He was looking at the woman who now legally controlled his entire corporate existence. The woman he had just offered a pathetic charity job in a basement was now the sole director of an $800 million oversight committee designed specifically to ruin him. Catherine was hyperventilating, her carefully curated high society facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She stared at my tailored suit, finally realizing it was not the cheap wardrobe of a desperate caterer. It was the impenetrable armor of a conqueror. She had packed my bags 7 years ago and told me I was socially inept. Now she was watching the most powerful men on the planet stand and applaud my brilliance. I slowly stepped away from the marble pillar. I did not say a single word to them. I did not need to issue any petty insults or hurl any desperate accusations. The roaring applause was doing all the talking for me. As I moved forward, I brushed my shoulder directly against my father's tuxedo. He flinched violently, shrinking back from my touch as if my suit were made of scorching fire. He was absolutely terrified. The crowd parted for me immediately. Billionaire defense contractors and senior government officials stepped aside, creating a wide, respectful path leading directly to the main stage. I walked with slow, measured precision. The sharp click of my heels echoed under the thunderous applause, perfectly synchronized with the steady beating of my heart. I passed the very men who had blacklisted me 7 years ago at my father's request. I saw the sudden recognition flash in their eyes, followed instantly by profound, sickening terror. They realized the girl they had starved out of the industry now held the executioner axe, and they were all standing on the chopping block. I reached the base of the stage. 2 heavily armed Secret Service agents stood at strict attention at the bottom of the carpeted stairs. They did not block my path or ask for my credentials. They offered me sharp, respectful nods, stepping aside to grant me unrestricted access to the highest platform of power in the nation. I ascended the stairs, feeling the heavy weight of the monumental moment settling over my shoulders. The Director of National Intelligence stepped back, smiling warmly as he guided me toward the center of the platform. The President of the United States stepped forward. He extended his hand, his expression radiating deep, genuine gratitude. "Thank you for your incredible service to this country," Meredith, the president, said, his voice carrying clearly over the microphone, capturing the absolute attention of the entire room. "You have saved us from a darkness we could not even see." I shook his hand firmly, feeling the bright flash of countless press cameras, documenting the absolute pinnacle of my silent, rigorous climb. The president stepped aside, gesturing gracefully for me to take the wooden podium. I walked forward and gripped the edges of the podium exactly as the director had done moments before. I looked out over the massive sea of expectant faces. From this elevated vantage point, I could see absolutely everything. I could see the terrified, sweating executives. I could see the respectful, highly decorated generals. And way in the back, standing near a marble pillar bathed in the fading edge of the spotlight, I could see the shattered, broken remains of the Caldwell family. They looked so incredibly small. The room fell into an absolute breathless silence, waiting for my command. I adjusted the microphone. I looked directly into my father's terrified, panicked eyes across the vast expanse of the ballroom. I took a deep, steadying breath and prepared to drop the final, devastating strike. "Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Director." The words left my lips and reverberated through the cavernous expanse of the grand ballroom. My voice was steady, carrying a cold and unwavering authority that commanded the absolute submission of every single person in attendance. I looked down at the polished wooden podium, gripping the edges with relaxed, confident hands. I gazed out over the sea of faces. The top military brass looked up at me with profound respect. The legacy defense contractors, the men who had blacklisted me 7 years ago, looked up at me with unadulterated terror. Way in the back, standing near the shadows of the marble pillar, my family remained utterly paralyzed. Harrison Caldwell had not moved a single muscle. His face was a portrait of complete systemic shock. Preston was visibly trembling, clutching his stomach as if the sheer reality of his impending destruction was making him physically ill. Catherine stood rigid, stripped of all her high society arrogance, reduced to a terrified spectator in a world she thought she controlled. I held their collective gaze for one long, terrifying second, letting them feel the absolute crushing weight of my presence. Then I turned my attention back to the broader audience. For decades, the American defense infrastructure has been treated as a lucrative playground for legacy corporations. I began my voice ringing with a sharp, ruthless clarity. We have trusted our national security to entities that value their quarterly profit margins far above the lives of the men and women serving on the front lines. We have allowed a culture of catastrophic complacency to infect our digital borders. We have permitted executives to secure massive federal contracts through country club handshakes rather than verifiable technical supremacy. That era of arrogant negligence is officially over. Today marks the dawn of a new impenetrable standard. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. I paced my delivery, allowing the gravity of my words to strike the corporate executives right in the chest. As the newly appointed director of the National Cybersecurity Oversight Board, my mandate is not to negotiate with failing vendors. My mandate is to protect the United States of America from the existential threat of digital warfare. Therefore, I am announcing my first official executive action. Effective immediately, the board is launching a total, comprehensive, and completely uncompromising audit of all legacy defense contractors currently operating within the federal ecosystem. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Men in expensive suits shifted nervously, wiping sudden sweat from their foreheads. The implications of an immediate total audit, led by the architect of the Zero Trust Protocol, were devastating. They knew they could not hide their lazy security measures from my algorithms. I continued without giving them a moment to breathe. We will not be accepting internal corporate reports. We will not be granting extensions. My teams at Aegis Vanguard will directly penetrate your networks. If we find that your systems are compromised, if we discover that you have prioritized budget cuts over unbreakable encryption, your clearance will be revoked permanently. I reached into the pocket of my navy suit and pulled out a small, sleek digital remote. I pointed it toward the massive presentation screen suspended behind the stage. To illustrate the exact nature of the dangerous incompetence this board was created to eradicate, I want to show you a prime example of the fatal negligence we are currently hunting, I announced, pressing the button on the remote. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly as the massive screens flared to life. Projected across the screens in glowing bright green text was a highly recognizable snippet of raw software code. It was heavily redacted to protect classified network pathways, but to any seasoned cybersecurity professional in the room, the architecture of the code was unmistakably clear. I looked straight at the back of the room, locking my eyes onto Preston Caldwell. I watched his knees actually buckle. He let out a visible gasp, stumbling backward until his spine hit the marble pillar. He recognized his own work immediately. It was the exact botched code patch he had deployed 7 years ago. It was the automated, cheap Band-Aid fix he had stolen credit for using it to secure his promotion as Senior Executive Vice President, while simultaneously leaving the Department of Defense completely vulnerable to a catastrophic backdoor exploit. Take a very close look at the screens behind me, I instructed the audience, my voice slicing through the thick, terrified silence of the ballroom. This is not the work of a sophisticated foreign intelligence syndicate. This is the work of an American defense contractor. This specific string of code was deployed into a highly classified military supply chain matrix. The executives responsible for this deployment claimed it was a fully encrypted zero-day patch. They charged the federal government millions of dollars for this solution, and they collected massive executive bonuses for their supposed brilliance. But as any competent analyst can clearly see, this is nothing but an automated masking sequence. The developers did not close the backdoor exploit. They simply painted over it, leaving our global troop movements completely exposed to any hostile entity with a basic decryption algorithm. I let the code burn into the retinas of every single executive in the room. I watched the four-star generals narrowing their eyes in pure disgust as they analyzed the projected failure. I watched the Secretary of Defense clench his jaw in absolute fury. I turned my attention back to Harrison Caldwell. My father was clutching his chest, his breath coming in short, rapid heaves. He knew exactly what was on that screen. He knew he had personally signed off on that exact code to protect Preston. He knew that I had kept the receipts for 7 long years, and now I was projecting his federal treason onto massive screens inside the White House. This is the exact breed of arrogant, lethal incompetence that Aegis Vanguard is going to hunt down and permanently eradicate. I declared, my voice ringing with a terrifying absolute certainty. We are no longer tolerating executives who steal credit for work they do not understand. We are no longer funding corporations that shield their incompetent golden children while putting American soldiers in grave danger. If your architecture relies on lies, masking sequences, and blatant nepotism, my board will find you, and we will dismantle your operation down to the absolute bedrock. There will be nowhere to hide your technical failures. You will face the full, unforgiving weight of federal prosecution. I clicked the remote, and the massive screens went completely black. The message had been delivered with surgical, devastating precision. I stepped back from the heavy wooden podium. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Prepare your servers. We are coming. The entire ballroom erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. The military officials cheered wildly, showing their profound appreciation for a leader who was finally bringing real accountability to a thoroughly corrupt sector. The sound of their applause crashed over me like a wave of pure validation. I nodded respectfully to the President of the United States and the Director of National Intelligence. They shook my hand again, their faces beaming with absolute triumphant approval. I turned away from the podium and began my descent down the carpeted stairs of the main stage. The sea of billionaires and defense titans parted immediately, forming a wide, highly respectful path for me to exit the ballroom. They looked at me with a complex mixture of absolute reverence and stark, freezing terror. I kept my posture completely straight, my expression an unreadable mask of elite professional composure. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and began walking straight down the central aisle, a sudden frantic movement caught my attention. Breaking violently through the pristine crowd with zero regard for diplomatic protocol was Harrison Caldwell. He was sweating profusely through his expensive tailored tuxedo, leaving dark, wet patches under his arms. His face was a sickly pale gray, and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. The arrogant, powerful chief executive officer who had just threatened to have me thrown out of the building was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, terrified old man who had just watched his entire corporate legacy evaporate into digital dust. He realized that the daughter he discarded now held the absolute power to send him to federal prison. He shoved past a junior senator and practically threw himself directly into my path, completely ignoring the heavily armed Secret Service agents who immediately moved to intercept him. I held up a single steady hand, signaling the federal guards to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what he had to say. Harrison stopped mere inches away from me, gasping for air like a drowning victim. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out as if to grab my arm, but he forced himself to stop, terrified of the limitless power I now wielded. He looked at the surrounding generals, watching him with sheer disgust. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, his eyes begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. "Meredith, sweetie," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine that echoed slightly in the quiet space surrounding us. "Please, we need to talk." I looked at the man who had thrown me out onto the street. I looked at the man who had confidently called me a paranoid liability and ruthlessly blacklisted me from my own industry. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I simply smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile that carried the absolute crushing weight of a digital executioner. "I don't speak to unvetted vendors," I said, my words slicing cleanly through his completely shattered ego, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. "Contact my reception desk." I walked past my father, leaving him gasping for air in the center of the grand ballroom, and stepped out into the cool Washington evening. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in bureaucratic efficiency and digital demolition. I did not need to act out of vengeance or malice. The mechanisms of justice I had meticulously put in place simply began to operate exactly as designed. Aegis Vanguard officially initiated a comprehensive, unannounced audit of Caldwell Logistics and Defense. We did not send polite email notifications or schedule boardroom meetings to discuss the terms of our investigation. We executed a federal mandate with absolute military precision. At precisely 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, 20 of my senior threat intelligence operatives walked through the heavy frosted glass doors of the Caldwell headquarters in Virginia. They wore sharp, dark suits displaying their federal badges with quiet authority. They bypassed the stunned receptionist, ignored the frantic security guards, and plugged our proprietary decryption drives directly into their central mainframes. The digital lockdown was absolute and instantaneous. Within 10 seconds, every single terminal inside the Caldwell building was frozen, displaying the silver shield logo of the National Cybersecurity Oversight Board. No files could be deleted. No hard drives could be wiped. No desperate executives could shred paper documents or cover their tracks. My team locked the entire company in an impenetrable federal digital quarantine. I monitored the operation from my command center in Alexandria, watching the raw data flow onto my secondary screens like a torrential flood of undeniable evidence. What my operatives uncovered was far worse than mere incompetence. It was a staggering landscape of gross negligence and deliberate corporate fraud. We dug into the architecture of Preston's digital infrastructure department, ripping apart the code he had supposedly managed for years. The deeper we went, the more the rotting foundation of his golden child status was exposed to the light. He had not just deployed one defective patch, he had actively compromised dozens of classified logistics networks over the span of 7 years. He consistently bypassed mandatory federal penetration tests by feeding falsified simulation data to the Department of Defense. He fabricated security reports, claiming his firewalls were military-grade, when they were actually riddled with critical vulnerabilities that any amateur hacker could bypass. But the absolute worst discovery was not the broken code. It was the financial trail. Preston had been systematically embezzling federal funds allocated for cybersecurity upgrades. My forensic accountants traced a massive web of phantom third-party vendor accounts routing millions of taxpayer dollars meant for encryption software directly into his own private offshore holdings. That was exactly how he afforded his luxury yachts, his sports cars, and his expensive bespoke suits. He was stealing directly from the American military budget and hiding the missing funds beneath layers of fake diagnostic reports. He was not just a lazy technical moron who relied on nepotism to survive. He was a federal criminal operating with complete unchecked impunity. He genuinely believed that the Caldwell name made him completely untouchable by the law. The most devastating piece of evidence, however, was the paper trail connecting Preston's crimes directly to the chief executive officer. Harrison Caldwell possessed the ultimate absolute authority over the company. He reviewed the budget allocations. He submitted the compliance guarantees to the Pentagon. Every single falsified security report and every single fraudulent vendor invoice bore my father's digital signature. Harrison knew his son was grossly unqualified to run a defense department. He knew Preston was faking the data to maintain his unearned status as the corporate prodigy. Instead of auditing the department and protecting national security, my father deliberately chose to sign off on the massive ongoing fraud. He chose to risk the lives of American soldiers just to protect his son from accountability and to keep his company stock artificially inflated. Because Harrison authorized those documents, he was now completely federally liable for every single crime his son had committed. The hammer dropped with terrifying speed. I submitted the finalized audit report directly to the Secretary of Defense and the Department of Justice. At midnight on a Thursday, Caldwell Logistics and Defense was officially stripped of all its federal security clearances. The loss of clearance triggered a mandatory automatic termination of all their active military contracts. The financial market reaction was violent and immediate. When the opening bell rang on Wall Street the next morning, investors fled the company like rats fleeing a burning ship. Caldwell Logistics stock plummeted from $80 a share to mere pennies in less than 2 hours. The trading floor halted their stock multiple times, but the catastrophic bleeding could not be stopped. Major institutional investors dumped their holdings in a blind panic. News anchors broadcasted the total collapse of the corporate empire my father had built and prized above his own daughter. It evaporated into worthless digital dust before lunchtime. The total collapse of the company was only the beginning of their nightmare. With the undeniable proof of embezzlement and falsified federal safety records fully secured, the Department of Justice moved forward with severe criminal indictments. Early the next morning, a convoy of dark sport utility vehicles pulled up to the Caldwell estate in Great Falls. Armed federal agents raided the mansion, seizing their physical assets, freezing their personal bank accounts, and confiscating Preston's luxury vehicles straight from the driveway. Catherine Caldwell stood in the foyer screaming in absolute horror as agents cataloged her expensive jewelry and designer artwork as evidence of assets purchased with stolen federal funds. My father and brother were placed in handcuffs right in their own grand hallway and dragged out the front doors into federal custody. They were facing decades in prison for wire fraud conspiracy against the United States and gross negligence resulting in national security breaches. The cameras flashed, capturing their utter humiliation for the evening news cycle. This was the exact moment the fragile, toxic loyalty of the Caldwell family completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. My father and brother were placed in separate, isolated interrogation rooms at the federal building downtown. They were offered the stark, unforgiving reality of their situation. The federal prosecutors laid the Aegis Vanguard audit reports flat on the metal tables, showing them the exact unassailable evidence of their crimes. There was no spinning the narrative. There were no public relations managers to craft a sympathetic story. They were cornered by their own digital footprints, facing the very real prospect of spending the rest of his natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The golden child violently turned on his ultimate enabler, Preston Caldwell. The boy who had been handed absolutely everything, the son who had been shielded from every single consequence his entire life, instantly shattered under the pressure. He completely broke down in the cold, sterile interrogation room. He wept openly, his face buried in his hands, desperately searching for a way to save his own skin. Without a single ounce of hesitation or familial loyalty, Preston threw our father directly under the bus. He accepted a plea deal from the federal prosecutors, eagerly agreeing to testify as the primary state witness against Harrison Caldwell. In a recorded deposition, Preston claimed that he was merely following direct orders. He lied through his teeth, stating that our father had violently forced him to falsify the security reports and hide the embezzled funds. He painted Harrison as a tyrannical corporate mastermind who controlled every aspect of the fraud, actively claiming that he was terrified of our father's wrath if he did not comply with the illegal schemes. He weaponized the very same manipulative tactics he had used against me 7 years ago. But this time he aimed the blade directly at the man who had protected him. Harrison Caldwell was sitting in a holding cell, staring at the concrete wall, when his high-priced defense attorney delivered the devastating news of his son's absolute betrayal. The great chief executive officer who had sacrificed his own daughter, who had joyfully destroyed my career to protect his son, now had to face the ultimate agonizing irony. He had burned my life to the ground to keep Preston on a pedestal. And that very same son had just signed a federal testimony declaring Harrison the sole architect of the entire criminal conspiracy. The perfect, elite family dynamic they had projected to the high society world for decades was finally exposed as a hollow, venomous lie. Harrison realized far too late that protecting a coward only breeds a traitor. The Caldwell men were entirely destroyed not by my hand, but by the sheer crushing weight of their own monumental greed and profound disloyalty. Their glorious kingdom was dead, and they had securely locked themselves inside the burning castle. I watched it all unfold from my command center, sipping a cup of dark coffee, knowing I had finally won the war. This was the absolute pinnacle of my long-awaited justice. With her husband and son locked inside cold federal holding cells, Catherine Caldwell realized her carefully curated high society life was rapidly disintegrating into absolute ruin. But my mother was a creature born of elite public relations and bottomless vanity. She utterly refused to go quietly into the night. She genuinely believed she could spin a federal treason indictment into a tragic tale of maternal suffering. Operating on pure delusion, Catherine contacted a sympathetic local news station in Washington, leaning heavily on her dwindling country club connections to secure an exclusive prime-time interview. I sat calmly in my secure command center, sipping hot coffee while watching the broadcast air live on one of my secondary high-definition monitors. Catherine looked exactly like a seasoned actress, playing the role of a devastated matriarch. She wore a modest pale blue blouse, stripped of her usual heavy diamond necklaces and expensive pearl earrings. Her makeup was applied with strategic, calculated perfection to make her appear completely exhausted and profoundly heartbroken. When the journalist asked about the sudden collapse of Caldwell Defense, Catherine dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a white tissue. She looked directly into the camera lens and began spinning a masterclass in toxic manipulation. She claimed that I was an estranged, fiercely vengeful daughter who had orchestrated a massive federal setup to punish my family for a minor misunderstanding years ago. She painted me as an unstable rogue hacker who used illegal government connections to maliciously frame her innocent husband and her brilliant son. She told viewers she had spent the last 7 long years crying herself to sleep every single night praying for her lost daughter to come home. She begged the public to understand that her family was the true victim of a vicious vendetta designed to destroy an American legacy. It was a spectacular performance of absolute unchecked delusion. But Catherine misunderstood the new rules of modern engagement. She thought we were still fighting in the outdated court of public opinion, where fake tears dictated the truth. She did not realize I held the absolute digital high ground. I did not call a frantic press conference to defend my character. I did not hire an expensive corporate lawyer to issue a polite, measured statement of denial. I simply reached into my encrypted cloud servers and retrieved the high-definition audio file I recorded at the White House Defense Summit. I bypassed the local news station entirely and uploaded the raw, unedited audio file directly to every major national news syndicate, political blog, and defense forum in the country. The digital drop took less than 5 seconds to execute. The explosive audio file spread across the internet like a violent, uncontrollable wildfire. Within 10 minutes, the entire nation was listening to the unvarnished reality of the Caldwell family. They heard Harrison Caldwell explicitly admit to deploying defective military code just to protect his incompetent son. They heard him confess to maliciously firing me to cover up a national security vulnerability. They heard Preston smugly offer me a humiliating charity job while threatening me. And worst of all for my mother, they heard Catherine Caldwell herself hissing that I was an embarrassment and threatening to leave me rotting in a miserable hovel. The public backlash was instantaneous and catastrophic. The local news station that aired Catherine's interview was forced to issue an immediate retraction and a public apology for broadcasting a fabricated narrative without proper due diligence. The viral audio recording completely shattered the fragile, crumbling remains of Catherine's elite social standing in an instant. The powerful Washington high society circles that she had spent decades meticulously cultivating turned their backs on her overnight, treating her like a highly contagious disease. The prestigious country clubs permanently revoked her exclusive memberships, citing morality clauses in their strict corporate bylaws. The elite charity boards she chaired for years demanded her unconditional resignation, completely scrubbing her name from their websites. Her so-called lifelong friends, the wealthy women who had attended her lavish galas and sipped her expensive champagne, completely refused to return her frantic, desperate phone calls. When Catherine stubbornly tried to attend a prominent social luncheon the following week, the event organizers physically blocked her at the grand entrance and politely asked her to leave the premises immediately. She was completely ostracized, permanently exiled from the only affluent world she had ever truly valued. The cold, calculating woman who had packed my bags and thrown me out of her house was now a total pariah trapped in a massive, empty mansion that the federal government was actively preparing to seize as evidence of federal fraud. Her precious family brand was entirely incinerated, permanently replaced by a dark legacy of fraud, arrogance, and unparalleled public disgrace. Every elite door she had ever walked through was now permanently locked against her. 6 months quickly passed, bringing quiet, absolute peace to my new reality. The intense, deafening media storms surrounding the violent Caldwell family collapse eventually faded into the background noise of the city, replaced by the steady, rigorous rhythm of my daily operations. I stood right in the center of the Aegis Vanguard Command Center, looking through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling, beautiful Washington skyline. The bright morning sun reflected perfectly off the flowing Potomac River and the distant white marble monuments, casting a warm golden glow over the federal district. The damp, freezing basement in Arlington felt like an entire lifetime away, a distant nightmare belonging to a different person. My company had expanded massively since the successful implementation of the Zero Trust mandate. We now occupied the top 3 floors of a premier commercial skyscraper in the absolute heart of the city. The command center buzzed with the quiet, focused energy of 50 elite cybersecurity architects actively monitoring global threat matrices on massive digital displays. These were the brilliant outcasts I personally recruited, the dedicated professionals who operated with absolute integrity and peerless technical skill. They did not care about wealthy social pedigrees or exclusive country club memberships. They only cared about the code, and they cared deeply about protecting the nation from the very threats my brother casually ignored. As I quietly watched the busy city wake up below me, my encrypted personal phone vibrated gently on my sleek glass desk. A secure notification popped up on the bright screen, indicating an incoming voicemail from an unverified federal correctional facility number. I picked up the device and tapped the screen, routing the clear audio through my encrypted wireless earpiece. The voice that echoed in my ear was incredibly weak, gravelly, and completely devoid of its former booming, toxic arrogance. It was Harrison Caldwell. He was calling directly from a cold maximum security federal holding center, anxiously waiting for his official sentencing hearing. Meredith. He began, his tired voice cracking with sheer pathetic desperation. Please do not hang up the phone. I know you are listening to this message. I know you have the power and the money to fix this terrible situation. Preston is falling apart in here. The federal prosecutors are offering him 30 hard years if he does not provide more evidence against me. He is terrified, Meredith. We desperately need money for a better defense team. The public defenders are entirely useless, and they do not care about us. I am begging you right now. You have massive federal contracts. You have millions of dollars sitting in your accounts. You can afford to float us a simple loan just until we finally sort out this entire mess. We are your family, Meredith. Please remember that blood is thicker than water. I did not even wait for him to finish his pathetic, groveling sentence. I smoothly pressed the red button on my phone screen, permanently deleting the voicemail mid-sentence. The audio vanished into nothingness, erasing his desperate pleas from my existence. The phrase "blood is thicker than water" was nothing but a cheap manipulative tool used by toxic people to demand unearned loyalty. I looked away from my phone and let my gaze sweep across the busy command center. I watched my lead intelligence analyst hand a fresh cup of coffee to our newest coder. I saw two network architects laughing quietly over a shared inside joke, while simultaneously blocking a hostile foreign intrusion. They operated seamlessly, lifting each other up and covering each other's blind spots without question. This was my true family. I had handpicked every single one of them based on merit, loyalty, and mutual respect. I had forged an unbreakable bond in the fires of genuine adversity. I smiled, feeling a profound, unshakable warmth radiating through my chest. The Caldwells had always demanded absolute submission to sit at their elite, miserable table. They thought they controlled the only chairs that mattered. They told me I was not invited to their world. They were right. I did not need an invitation to their world. I bought the building. Looking back on the collapse of my father's corporate empire, I realized the greatest lesson I learned was never actually about revenge. It was about recognizing the true nature of power and self-worth. For the first 26 years of my life, I allowed my family to dictate my value. I believed that because they were my blood, their cruel opinions were the absolute truth. I thought my role was to work twice as hard just to be treated with half the respect my brother received without trying. But the day they threw me out into the street was actually the day they set me free. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic where you are constantly treated like a burden or a scapegoat, you need to understand one crucial truth. Their inability to see your worth does not decrease your value. People who rely on manipulation and nepotism will always be terrified of genuine competence. They will try to keep you small because your growth exposes their profound insecurities. You do not have to spend your life begging for a seat at a table where you are continuously disrespected. You have the power to walk away and build your own table. The struggle will be incredibly painful, but it will forge you into something unbreakable. True family is not determined by biology. It is determined by mutual respect, loyalty, and the people who choose to stand by you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to finally discover your true potential? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and reclaiming your power. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder today that they do not need an invitation to succeed. Thank you for watching.